This is the Illiac Suite, a podcast on AI-driven music. Join me as we dive into the ever-evolving world of AI and music, where algorithms become the composers and machines become the virtuosos. Yes, this music and text was written by a computer, and I am not real, but
I am, and my name is Dennis Kastrup. Hello humans, welcome to a new episode of the Illiac Suite. I'm honest with you today. The last 4 weeks were actually pretty quiet in the field of music and AI. No groundbreaking news, I have the feeling. Is it because all has been done? Is it because the world politics are taking all the attention? Is it because it is winter in the northern hemisphere? Or is it because I'm not up to date anymore? Maybe it is a mixture of all these points, except the last one, of course. But in the end, there is always something to talk about. And this time I invited someone who is working in the field of music and technology since ages. His name is Andrew Melchior, or in English we would say Andrew Melchior. A friend of mine suggested me Andrew for an episode because he said that he has so many interesting things to talk about. So I reached out to Andrew and I'm very happy that he said yes. But before you will hear our interview, I would like to give you some more information about him. I asked this lovely AI voice to tell me more.
Melchior began as a classically trained pianist and later explored digital music production and internet technologies, leading to a job at EMI Music. His career expanded into photography, digital energy, and augmented reality, eventually working with Magic Leap and renowned artists like Björk and Massive Attack. He played a key role in innovative projects such as Björk Digital, the VR album Vulnicura, and AI-driven music experiences. Since COVID, he has been a freelance artist, working on AI-driven creative projects, including a sonic artwork for the European Capital of Culture 2026 and an AI-powered spatial audio experience in Poland.
Pretty fascinating, I think. I'm honest with you, before the interview, I had originally planned to talk with him about artificial intelligence and music and the ecological impact of that, because since months I also wanted to produce an episode about that problem that we use so much energy to generate music. But I postpone this now to another episode in the future. We had some words, Andrew and I, and we talked, and we just got a little bit lost in the flow. And we had so many different subjects to talk about, so I just let it go. And I can say it was really, really worth it. I leave you now with the interview where Andrew first of all tells us what he is doing at the moment.
Currently, I'm working out of my home studio in Krakow, where I'm based currently in Poland, and I'm developing a couple of projects, one of which is a European Capital of Culture commission I have for 2026 in Oulu in Finland, and that is basically a sonic artwork I'm designing with a guy from MIT called Professor Kiyoshi Masui. And it's using sonifications of fast radio bursts, which are these cosmic intergalactic radio signals, some of which are very old, coming from the other side of the galaxy. And basically, I've worked with Professor Masui to sonify 500 of about 4,000 that we've recorded since 2001. And those are being installed into a cathedral in Oulu, which is just outside of Lapland in northern Finland, as part of their Capital of Culture celebrations next year. And it will be an installation with the hardware company Genelec. We're building this 12.4 speaker system inside the cathedral, and we're basically pulsing these sonifications into the space using a bunch of code, time of day, time of year, and crossing over between both the astronomical data as well as the religious data to try and kind of create a conversation between science and spirituality. So I'm doing that at the moment. And then another thing I'm working on, which is more AI, but not musical AI, actually. Interesting. It's to do with spoken word. Whilst living in Krakow, I'm working with the Jewish Cultural Festival here. Krakow was one of the ghettos that was liquidated by the Nazis at the end of the Second World War. And so there are a lot of buildings, but no people. related to the buildings. So I've been working with them here to build a location-based audio narrative, which will allow the visitors who come to the Capital of Culture, to the Jewish Cultural Festival, the opportunity to listen to voices of previous inhabitants of the city, talking about their experiences in the Jewish quarter and things like that. And we'll be using, interestingly, for that we're using 11 labs and a bunch of location-based audio triggers based on geofencing to generate sort of procedural narratives in different languages.
And the first project was not involving AI, you said, right?
No, that's right. I mean, to be honest, we can go into this detail now because obviously that's the reason we're having this conversation. But everything and anything code based, you can find excuses to use AI at the moment. But I didn't feel that was necessary for this, so I've been using Super Collider, the software tool, to build a programmatic sort of planetarium in a way, which will be triggering these audio samples that we've created, these sonified radio bursts. And there wasn't really any reason to use AI. We weren't trying to clean up any, weak signals from outer space because these signals are not within human hearing range. So this was more about scripting data into sonic form to create representation of the radio bursts. So with that, I didn't need.
Yeah,
I didn't need.
I mean, what I found out also in the last years, I mean, people using AI. When I started to cover AI in music, actually, in the beginning, I had the feeling people were using the word AI just so I cover them. They were like, if I use the word AI, the journalist will come and talk about this, and it was like this in the beginning a little bit. People were using it just to get attention. I had the feeling, and sometimes I was not even sure if it was AI because you could never prove it in the end. I mean, somebody can tell me that's what I've done with AI, but in the end, it was not done with AI. Have you experienced this also in the late, I don't know, years or
yeah? So I could go, So interestingly, if we go back in time a bit, so about 10 years ago, I did some work for a company called Magic Leap. And Magic Leap were building augmented reality glasses. They were Google funded. And they were building real-time mixed reality hardware that you would wear on your eyes. And the idea was to create music and video and graphic and game experiences for that. And during that process, I got to work with Massive Attack and Sigur Rós and Björk and a bunch of other artists, which was good. But what was interesting at the time was we were looking at how wearables like that could change the experience of listening to music. So we did Robert Del Naya and myself, the founder of Massive Attack, we met and started discussing sort of concepts for a music player that would basically try and understand how music could be created and consumed on a device like that, where you had location data, you had time of flight, time of day, you would even have eye tracking, maybe gestures, and obviously binaural spatial sound with head tracking. So we bundled all these ideas into an app that we built originally for iPhone called Phantom. And it was like an art project, really. It wasn't really a commercial project. And interestingly, Johnny Ive, Robert knows Johnny Ive. Robert knows everyone. And Robert knows Johnny Ive. And we ended up going to Cupertino, and Johnny went, oh, here's a new thing called the Watch. And so we got very early access to Apple Watch. And what we were able to do with that was use the heart rate as well as all the other data from the phone, including the camera and the screen. And originally, I did understand how we could have tried to use AI for that, but at the time, the models weren't there. I mean, it was too early. We had a good idea, but it was too early to execute in the way you would do it now, for instance. So based on your question, yes, humorously, we used to call it mandrolic. So instead of AI, people go, oh, how's the software kernel working? Is it AI? We would go, no, it's forced pattern language programmed by sensors, sensor fusion. And we would have to go into the way the application worked is we would feed it stems from songs, and then we would write a set of rules for this bass line with those drums, but never with those vocals, kind of, and/or operators for these stems to keep some of the musicality in of the remixes. But it wasn't AI. And interestingly, even with the developments in AI now, it would still be interesting to see what it spit out, because I'm not convinced that the composition is still, something that is, if you're going to do very mechanical, repetitive techno and things like that, I suppose you wouldn't notice as much. But with songs, interestingly, with songs with a human touch, I still feel it's quite easy to recognize this sort of canned version of sort of creative music making.
I was just like, I just had a quick idea. You were not part of the Björk installation on a hotel where they were using choirs.
No, that was Arca. No, I had a chat about that, but that was Arca. And so Arca and we had a chat about this years ago, and he ended up doing this thing with the IBM, New York, with a lobby. And that was interesting. Again, it's that was, I think, with Bronze. So there was this platform called Bronze that spun out of Goldsmiths College in London, who Robert and I actually also work with, and they were building this platform that is going to sort of real time create music.
Just to explain to the listeners, I did a report about it. It was in a hotel in an installation, and on the top, I think they were watching the sky or taking data from the sky and using pre-recorded choirs of Björk and her choir or some choirs, and they were changing the music in the sense how the weather was changing, and it was on top of the.
That's right. It was called Kordestafan originally. I seem to remember it was with Microsoft.
Yeah. I remember this.
And they interestingly, well, I'll tell you a secret story, which is now not going to be secret, but the thing they were doing with that was she had her choir in New York ready for the Cornucopia tour, which was launching at the Shed. And they had this very large choir. And to give them all something to keep them occupied whilst they were waiting for the sets to be built and the orchestra to come together, they basically did this fun little side project. As I say, it was I think it's AI generated music, but it was Juliana Barwick, I think, composed it.
I don't remember the name.
And there was a score that Arca wrote using Bronze AI engine.
Well, if we are here now telling stories to people who have never heard these stories, I can tell you a quick story about Björk too, because I was at a festival in Finland at the Flow Festival, and I remember I was going out late and I had some fun, I had some drinks, and one of my friends said, "Oh, we're going home now." Björk was playing there the night before, the evening, and it was like, "Oh, we're going home now." I stayed in the same hotel as the artist, I remember, and I stayed 10 more minutes late for another drink, and then I went home in the hotel. I slept, I wake up in the morning, and the next morning the guy told me, "I had the most amazing night of my life." It's like, what? It was another journalist. And it's like, when we went back to the hotel, all the choir of Björk was singing there. Björk was there. We were having a party in the lobby. But then the hotel said, "Oh, you have to go back to your suite because you're gonna do this down here." So she invited everybody to go into the suite, and we were like singing all night long in the suite with Björk and dancing. And at one point, I was sitting on a bed and I was talking to a girl, and she said, "Oh, my name is Feist," and I was like, and I just missed this by 10 minutes because I was having another drink. So that's my story. But it was a wonderful night, I've heard. Talking a little, we hear a podcast about AI and music, talking about AI and music. Maybe you can. As you're in that field, you're working with this, and you're experimenting a lot of new inventions and new roads there. Maybe tell me a little bit about how you embraced, or maybe later on not embraced, AI, in the sense that it came into your life and you were interested and you thought, "Oh, those possibilities are on the horizon. This will happen, and this is what excites me about it." Maybe tell me a little bit the story of you and AI.
So I was first really interested in AI for writing music by a project that was started by Google called Magenta. And Google Magenta was set up by a guy called Doug Eck. and Doug Eck and a bunch of his team were basically working on developing sort of these generated scores and a sort of studio. The idea was to build a sort of studio interpolated tool that would allow you, eventually ended up being integrated into Ableton and things like that. And it was, they were basically training models using open source performances and materials. And they were, to a greater and lesser degree, had some interesting experience with drums and some generative content rather than necessarily using style transfer. And they ended up building this MIDI plugin, which sort of had a groove and a generative and drumify kind of interpolated function. And that was the first time I really got interested in that. Robert Del Noja and I were definitely interested in that area because we were working with this company making augmented reality headsets. We were interested in this sort of procedurally generated soundtrack idea. So the Phantom player that we set up would, the way we built it was, it would use data points from your device and it would generate mixes based around the integers coming into your device from the camera and the clock and the heart rate and things. So we were very interested in where this was going to lead with AI. And so yeah, I was in on the Doug Eck experiment for a while. It was about that time I also came across a guy called Sander Dielman, and Sander Dielman was working for DeepMind. Is it DeepMind? And they set up a thing called WaveNets, and WaveNets were quite controversial at the time because Google decided not to release them because they were incredibly good at mimicking the human voice very quickly, just from like a minute's worth of audio. And interestingly, that product now seems to be what is 11 Labs, 5 or 6 years later. But originally they decided not to release it, anything like it, because I don't think so. But it's interesting. I'd be very interested to know where the source code for 11 Labs comes from, because there's not much talk about that. But yeah, we originally worked with Doug Eck and that team, and then I was then also aware of working at Goldsmiths. So Goldsmiths University in London, the sort of University of the Arts, was doing quite a lot of work also with AI, and I introduced the work that I was doing, Massive Attack, to a couple of their academic team, and that ended up being a project that sort of morphed into an exhibition at the Barbican that we did, which was called More Than Human, which was part of a Google Arts and Culture project. I think we also ended up doing a thing for UK Research and Innovation. It was a sort of project called Mimic, and we did that with Mick Grierson, who was a course leader at Goldsmiths at the time, and it was using sort of WaveNets, Magenta. It was messing around with sort of convolutional neural networks, recurrent neural networks, all the sort of buzzwords at the time, and we were trying to sort of humanize some of the output of that, really. So this is the kind of where my entry point was, and that was at the time quite academic. It wasn't commercially available software. It was quite a lot that was blue sky sort of bootstrapped software that had to run in a custom wrapper, and you had to know what you were doing with the models to do the training and all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of where I was introduced to the idea. Now, just to go into that slightly more, I was a classically trained pianist, so I know about things like player pianos, and I was always aware of MIDI from a long time ago, because I was born in the 70s, so by the 80s when MIDI first turned up, I was one of the first kids on the block to have a MIDI keyboard. I got a Krumar Bit 99 along with a guy called Graham Massey, who was in 808 State in Manchester, and there was this crazy music shop called Chase, run by a couple of Sikh brothers, and they had these amazing, for some reason they had this amazing set of keyboards that were the Italian company Krumar, and you could buy these crazy MIDI, the first version, sort of quite clunky MIDI keyboards. So I've been experimenting
When was this around?
85, I think 86, quite really early,
Okay.
right? So Dave Smith had obviously started the MIDI thing, and Krumar were one of the first to create this sort of this synth called the Bit 19. Well, at first it was Bit 1 and then the Bit 99. And so I started connecting Roland drum machines to MIDI keyboards very early on and doing weird stuff. And so I've always been aware of things because I was also very early doing days with Cubase and Cubase on the Amiga, running on SMPTE stripes on 16-track tape decks, and then the good old days. And then I was also aware of obviously as VST came in, I started direct-to-disc recording. So I've always been aware of the tech.
That's interesting.
And
yeah. That's interesting. If I hear this now, it's really interesting. I just have one question for you quickly for that. It's like because you're always interested in that tech stuff. Was the interest into tech on that side, like MIDI, keyboards, drum machines, whatever, different than the one when AI came along?
That's a good question. So I basically am the product of a home where my grandfather, my British grandfather, was in the British Army during the World War II, and he was in the Royal Corps of Signals. And the Royal Corps of Signals was the radio operators, basically the guys who were fixing these and making these valve-based radios for the troops to use. And he was always fascinated by electronics and engineering. Anyway, by the time I met him, he was quite an old guy, but he had this shed at the bottom of a garden. And in the garden shed were all these manner of circuits and capacitors and fuses and electronic, machinery. And he sort of got me very interested, as grandfathers do, in the thing he loved, and that was, making electronics. So I had a very early introduction to gadgets and electronics, and that, as a musician, I was learning the piano in the early 80s, and then I started getting very interested in electronic music. I mean, Jean-Michel Jarre was doing things like Oxygen, and even people like ABBA. I remember ABBA's last album, The Visitors, had these amazing Yamaha synths on it, and so I started listening to synthesized music because it was more interesting than Bach and Mozart and all the others, my Czerny exercises. And so I started getting really interested in synths, and from that point on, I got the bug, and in the late 80s, there was a great music shop in Manchester called A1 Music, and they had loads of really amazing sort of, stuff I could never afford, but they used to let you go in and play with it to sort of torture yourself. You couldn't afford it, but you could play with it.
But it was haptic, You could push on it, you can use it, you can put it in your hand, and that's maybe what's different with AI. I mean, yes, you can be on the computer and click on it, but you cannot touch it.
I mean, and it was, and it's interesting how that's gone full circle, because I remember, for instance, this keyboard I had, the Bit 99, that was all addressable via a single LED on the panel. And there was no knobs and dials, really. There was two faders, and it was like the antidote to all of the analog synths that had been around, and everybody thought direct digital control of synthesizers like the Yamaha DX7 and things like that was the way to go. But ironically, everything goes full circle, and now everybody loves knobs, buttons, and Euro rack and all this. It's hilarious in a way, because when you run old enough, you see the whole circle complete, as now everybody's back in the world of knobs and dials, and so I got into computer music quite early, and I was listening to a lot of electronic music. The obvious candidates like Depeche Mode, people using the sort of EMU emulator, and then a very interesting German band called Propaganda. And Propaganda wrote this amazing record called A Secret Wish, which was produced by Trevor Horn, and it was really one of the first albums I ever heard with Fairlight CMI on it that was really amazing, and this electronic reverbs and things, and that album really changed my perception of electronic music. There was a lot of amazing samples and drum programming on it.
Yeah. It's interesting you all mentioned this. I mean, I will have a talk soon here in Montreal about AI and generative music in general, and I have this thesis that I say generative AI is these days also a little bit punk, in the sense that AI enables, because the punks, I mean, there's a lot behind the idea. It's not just like making music, but I will come to that later. But it is punk in the sense that everybody now can make music like they want to. I mean, the punks were not able to play music. They were just putting 3 chords, and they were not able to sing, but they were getting somewhere with the music where they would have never been without the music. And in that sense, I have the feeling AI in this is possible to create some punk songs, like not real punk songs, but the attitude of punk, that everybody can make music these days. And that was like it was the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, when 80s was punk's already a little bit dying, I have to say. But would you agree with this? Like when you say,
well, yeah. I mean, Throbbing Gristle was the obvious example of that. I mean, Throbbing Gristle, Chris Carter used to build synthesizers for that band, and they were like recording in the late 70s. And then obviously also very interestingly, Joy Division from Manchester, I always thought it was very interesting because Rob Gretton from Factory Records, a few years ago, he sort of published his memoirs, and it was really interesting to look at the tour receipts for that band, because Joy Division and New Order spent a considerable amount of their money on synths. Like on the road, more than guitars or drums or anything like that. They were buying the latest and greatest, synthesizers they could get their hands on. And so there was a kind of crossover where punk started playing synths for sure, and I agree. I think the essence of punk and this idea of every man and every woman, everybody having a democratic access to these art forms that were quite rarefied and demanded, in the old days, demanded money and years of your dedication, and were sort of closed to everyone. But that definitely is an energy that sits inside of electronic music, and I think that's what sampling did as well. Because if you look at, for instance, Massive Attack, so they were using the Akai MPC to start off their recordings after being DJs. So they started off as DJs and the Wild Bunch, and then they started getting into sampling and using Akai and MPC and rack-mounted samplers. And a lot of that was the energy of, cutting and paste and collage, really, musical collage, where you could, if you couldn't, you couldn't score for a string orchestra, where you could sample a string orchestra and try and use the strings, and I think that's true. And with AI, it's similar. It is, I do think, I think some people won't appreciate the analogy, but it is similar in the sense that it democratizes music. I gave a talk a couple of months ago, and I was doing a thing in Novi Sad in Serbia, and I had to talk about my experience of music and AI, and I just recall, there was definitely a move in the 80s where, famously, I think the BBC orchestra, there was a BBC in-house orchestra, and they used to play on all the TV shows and the theme music for TV shows. And I think it was the Fairlight came out, and they started going on strike, and basically the orchestra went on strike with the Musicians Union because they were complaining that these samplers were stopping them from being used as orchestral musicians, and therefore they would go on strike. And I think the BBC one week or a couple of weeks went dark for Top of the Pops because there was a strike by the Musicians Union to protest at these new angled samplers. So I think that in some ways
there's an analogy.
And I think the culture is the same. People are now feeling threatened by the fact that music is generative and synthesized.
Do they have to be?
I'm not convinced. I don't think it's a threat in the way that people think it is. I think there's a lot of things to unravel with AI, and I think there's an anti-technology narrative, which is a anti-capitalist narrative that's quite difficult to unpick. And people are just, bashing anything that is technology because they feel it's part of the whole system that's bringing about climate change. And these things are suddenly there's a lot of complexity in these technology arguments that is not clear from a perspective of the old-fashioned idea. Because in the old idea, technology was innovation and moving society forward and seen as a force for good. There is a form, I think, of a backlash now where I think the excesses of Silicon Valley and some of the demonstrable money laundering that's gone on with tech that's left people disillusioned and feeling like it's part of the problem, not the solution. But I feel like that's not a whole nother conversation, but I think my perspective is I don't see AI music as any more of a threat than really using, I don't know, samples and using sequences and using arpeggiators. I mean, you could argue that everybody could have lost their mind about arpeggiators, and they could have lost minds about auto-programmed, even the Yamaha home organ where you'd press the key and you'd get the chord accompaniment.
Well,
You could say
yeah.
that was an early form of, putting musicians out of their jobs, but it's
But you described it pretty good. I mean, that's the thing, the argument I'm always bringing, and I think I said it already here in the podcast, is like, if you listen to music these days, and you love a song, and you say, okay, this is my song, I love it, I embrace it, I cry to it, it creates emotions for me I've never felt before. And then somebody tells you, that singer, because that's what musicians told me all the time, whenever there's a song out there, you do whatever you want with the song. It's your song, and you put your emotions, your feelings, your ideas on it, and you take that song, it's yours. And if I tell you that in the end this song was written not about a lover, it was written about a cat, and you made out of the song your song because you thought it was a song about a lover, and it's your song, it's your song. And that's the same with AI. If you listen to a song and you have emotions with that song in the end, and it's your song, why should you not listen to a song that is made by an AI then, if it's your song? If music creates that with you, it's your song. So technically, not a lot has changed for me in that sense. But, and that's what you also mentioned, the problem is these days, and I do see this, I think it's amazing for creating art. It will open doors we have never seen before. But I always have a problem with the democratizing word of this. Because yes, it is bringing the money to big tech companies because they can easily create platforms where all the people put their monthly money in there to pay for somebody who has used artworks from other people. That's my opinion. And I think it's a big political problem we have to solve. And it's not the problem that we have these things. It's a political problem we should solve, because democratizing means, yes, I pay less for an orchestra, but on the other hand, 5 million people pay less and they pay it to one company. And that's the problem, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's always these very big shifts societally. So my grandmother was born in 1918 in England, and she was born at the end of the First World War. And she used to talk to, because I worked in music tech and I like music, and so my grandmother, who obviously loved the fact I played music, and she was a proud grandmother, and so she remembered, and I remember her telling me this when I talked to her about the internet in the 90s. So I was really early on the internet, and I was working with David Bowie at EMI in the late 90s and BowieNet. And I tried to explain this. I tried to explain my job to my grandmother, which is always an interesting idea. And she,
I know that feeling.
And she came up with this really amazing analogy. And she said, "Oh, I remember in 1927, when I was only, I think she was like 9 years old. I remember going to the cinema, and everybody went to the cinema in those days. It was cheap and it was entertainment." And she said, "I remember going to the cinema and it was silent. And then one day in 1927, a guy called Al Jolson recorded the first talking motion picture. It was called The Jazz Singer. And it came out, and it was the first movie with a soundtrack that anybody ever saw. And she said the transition from silent films to talkies meant that all of a sudden, live orchestras and all the people who were employed in live orchestras had problems keeping their jobs. Because up until The Jazz Singer, unless you were very wealthy and you could afford a record player, which was the sort of upper class, middle class thing to have, you had to go to the local bar or the local vaudeville or to the park to listen to the brass band, and you had to go and listen to live music. As soon as the films came in with soundtracks, a bunch of musicians found themselves unemployed, right? And even live films, live accompaniment used to happen in silent films. The music's played like along the silent movie. But so it changed, and suddenly everybody was out of work, and it was displacement of the live orchestra. And tens of thousands of musicians, I think, lost their livelihoods in just a few years doing that. And the gig of scoring every show and every evening, sort of as they did, jobbing musicians sort of disappeared. The industry though adapted, and musicians started going into film studio orchestras. because music still needed orchestras, right? And Hollywood and radio networks as well. Radio networks, radio bands and orchestras. People went into the radio studios and started playing music through the radio. And then there was also retraining, and I did a bit of study into this because I thought, I'm into history. My mother was a history teacher, and history is a good way of understanding. Things aren't exactly the same each generation or every 100 years, but they do have echoes. Because humans, we wear different clothes and drive different vehicles, but we still have the same emotions and the same drivers. And so, I think instrumentalists in those days, they retrained. Some of them went into different jobs, obviously. And what was more interesting that was around then that I haven't seen anything of in this era is the unions. So the music union in the 1920s and 30s helped unemployed musicians because they had a union and union rates, and everybody paid a subscription to the union. And when everybody fell on their ass, the union was there to pick them up and also retrain them. And and then people sort of moved into sound engineering and soundtrack composers and orchestration in the 20s and 30s. One of the things I think is really interesting in our culture is that while all of this theory has been going on about, first of all, it was streaming and record industry falling on its ass and piracy, and now it's AI and it's stealing people's music and scraping people's music. Where is the musicians' union? Where is it? And where is the Performing Rights Society? And where is GEMA and ASCAP and all those people?
Well, GEMA is suing Suno right
They
now.
are, but this seal feels to me quite late, right? So let's play some role playing. You are in one of these rights organizations or a union, and you are paid by the members of that union to look at the day-to-day administration of their rights and of their issues around their employment and stuff like that. Why did these things that were on my radar and probably your radar, why were these things not on those people's radars 5 or 6 years ago when deals were being done and when things were going on?
I think they were just not able to cope with the speed. I think they were not understanding it. And one important thing you have to understand with all these rights with these companies is they sometimes still think in old patterns. And those patterns of old copyrights don't work anymore. I think this is the biggest problem. I think they have to adapt to a modern life in which the copyright system is a little bit outdated.
Oh, well, I mean, very outdated. I think the trouble is the shift is, like you say, quick. But I do think I'm not blaming anyone here, but I do think it's interesting to think. And it was the same for me when lockdowns happened and COVID happened. In the UK, especially, there was a huge problem with unemployment where freelance technology and technicians, producers, live engineers, roadies, everybody involved with live entertainment, there was suddenly no money. And in the UK, you did not get any relief from the state unless you had a limited company. And if you had a limited company, you were able to claim this thing called furlough, which was going to give you maybe 60 to 80% of your income based on a government allowance. The trouble is with all these people working in the music and production industry was they didn't have limited companies or freelance self-employed people. And so again, there was this problem where you realize that, I'm not just some raging Marxist, but you do realize that the musicians union and a union for musicians and a union for songwriters, like, the various songwriters guilds, obviously, but those kind of things like BASCA. I mean, I'm a member of BASCA, but these are these really quaint organizations that don't seem to have been able to keep up at all with any of the issues that are going on. So maybe there's a new way of doing stuff where, collectively people can have some control. I think the trouble is, without being too doomy about it, I think the cat is already run out of the bag. I don't think you can't put the lid back on these music models. So, like, interestingly, when I was talking to Douglas Eck at Magenta, I did ask him, I said, so, obviously you've got all of YouTube. Are you going around scraping all the YouTube music? And he didn't answer my question. And so what we have to assume is that really these, especially Google and people like this, we're obviously building these models for since probably 2016, 17, these models have started to be built. To be able to go back into those models and reverse engineer and try and find where your song is in all that corpus of it's impossible.
It's impossible.
So the only thing,
Yeah.
and this is an argument that hasn't been around for a while, but I remember this was always a good one. Because I am a man of a certain age, I remember when file sharing was the issue. Napster turned up in the late 90s. Suddenly everybody was sharing music on Napster, and then torrents turned up and LimeWire and things like that. And everyone was going, oh my God, how do we make money out of this? We can't. I still maintain the logical answer to that problem then is the same as the answer to the problem now. Who are the beneficiaries of data streaming products, such as mobile phone networks, internet service providers? Who are the beneficiaries of those companies? Well, in the UK, it's British Telecom, and in Poland where I am, it's like Orange Telecom, and you've got T-Mobile, all these people. Why, if you're a bar or a hotel, or you're another public venue and you play live music or recorded music, you have to pay a license for that? Why is there not an equivalent for all of these people offering streaming data services? Take it for granted that the majority of your users at some point are streaming music that's probably not paid for, or even is paid for maybe through Apple Music or Spotify, whatever. But why don't you just ask them to put a percentage or a couple of percentage of their profits every year into the Public Performing Rights Society basket? And that was a very unpopular suggestion of mine when I was at EMI, and I think it would still be a very unpopular suggestion now, but to me it's logical.
I totally agree. I think that model of licensing, of giving out licenses, is one idea to get the money back to the people who deserve it. But in many situations, not only the companies you've talked about, but also if the companies who generate AI music should pay for this in a yearly license fee or whatever, it also would be a little thing to put on top of the little amount of money which is existing for the artist anyhow. But this thing is a thing that cannot be done by just saying, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to sue them. This is a political thing, and that's the problem. It is a thing of, yes, what the unions should do. It's a political thing. It's a decision of the politicians. And that's the problem where we're heading right now. In the politics, there are more tech bros who decide what the politics have to be. And that's why it's so hard, I think, in my opinion, to get the money from those companies who profit from it.
I mean, I agree. And so, I was actually part of the problem. And it's funny, my girlfriend always, my girlfriend goes, oh my God, you were part of the problem. Because I remember in 2001, I was working with David Bowie, and we were thinking about mobile phones. And I'd worked for wireless access protocol forum with a WAP forum, and so WAP was the first version of internet on phones. I mean, this is how old I am. GPRS, Nokia phone was the first ever mobile internet phone, and
well, I'm old then too, if you tell this.
And but I was always interested in phones, and then obviously phones started doing ringtones. They were terrible, and they were like these beeping sounds. Anyway, at one point I got wind of a Nokia bringing out this new phone called the 7650, and it was going to be this new flagship phone with a color screen, a 1 megapixel camera on the back, and it was going to play polyphonic MIDI ringtones. And I was like, oh, polyphonic MIDI ringtones. I mean, I knew what those were, and they would sound a lot better than the beepy beep, phones of previous years. So we made a beeline for Nokia. And while I was at EMI, I actually got in touch with Nokia in the UK, and we did a deal. And David was the first artist to sign his publishing rights over for mobile phone ringtones on this Nokia phone. And so the Nokia phone came preloaded at retail with a bunch of David Bowie ringtones on it. And David loved showing off. He loved doing things for the first time and, being the clever one, he thought of it first. And so he loved that. But what I realized we did at that point is we opened the door to another company that you will have heard of called Apple. And Apple had just brought out their first version of the iPod. And I remember David's manager looking at what we did with Nokia, and he was also working with, he wasn't managing, he was working with U2 at the time. And lo and behold, our preloaded Nokia phone with ringtones turned into the U2 iPod with the entire back catalogue preloaded on this iPod. And the trouble was, this was the point where tech companies realized that the way to make devices sexy was to put music onto them. And at that point, the word content turned up. And as soon as music was referred to as content, you realized we were on a tricky road because, like you said about the tech bros, unfortunately, there was a generation of young people who remembered being charged a lot of money for CDs. And when you only wanted one song, you had to pay 20 euros for the whole CD. And a lot of people who hated that then worked in tech and decided the music industry was going to get it, and I think that's...
Although I can say I still like albums.
Yeah, I love albums. I love albums.
I mean, you discover songs which you have never would have listened before. That's a magic of an album, also.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, that was where the tech business started understanding the music, and then eventually film and all those things were going to make their devices much more attractive. Because obviously the killer blow was when Jobs decided to build a phone that was an iPod with a phone in it, and that was the end of everything, or the beginning of everything. So it's interesting. I mean, at the end of the day, we're sort of going around the history a lot. I suppose the point I'm making is that the relationship between technology and music has been around for as long as electronic engineering has happened. I mean, if you wanted to be anal, you could say that engineering and music has lived together since anybody wound a string tightly on a wooden device and plucked it, because that was the technology, right? Making music, and then printing, the printing press.
Yeah, that Kraftwerk song, Pop. What is it called? Pop music, maybe? No, there's a Kraftwerk song where they sing in German. Music will always continue as a container for new ideas. And that's what it is. Music has always been in the forefront if it comes to new ideas. They've always tried it out in the beginning. So yeah, and this time with AI also, music was pushing it a lot, and the discussion about AI started a lot also with AI music, because somebody was listening to a song from Eminem, which was not spoken by Eminem, but was created by some kid in New Jersey. I don't know, and that's how it started, and that's how the big discussion about this kind of got into the mainstream. That's what my feeling is, and it will continue this. But in the end, I mean, to sum it all up a little bit, like, you say there's a unions. I mean, that obviously there is something happening which is not going in a good direction with the music and AI, and I know we have to change, and artists will suffer, I'm pretty sure. But on the other side, I always think human music will always be the precious thing we will keep. It will not disappear. But what can we do, and where will we go?
So I think the answer I was almost heading towards with this story about Al Jolson and the jazz singer in 1928. I think my understanding as a musician and performer, as somebody who's played music in bands and on stage and in front of audiences, and also a musician who's recorded in studios and recorded and sent, and done that too. My inclination to be an optimist is to suggest that what we should be aiming for is not necessarily for politicians to try and ban AI, and to, like Paul McCartney's trying to ban, or at least get legislation to protect musicians and this sort of stuff. I think that's insightful and needs to be done. But I think what's really interesting, I was recently in the Czech Republic, and in the Czech Republic, all the school kids get free music lessons still. And culturally, that is a very interesting thing, because in the UK, you don't get music lessons for free anymore. My son is 14 and I have to pay for his piano lessons, and the era...
they get it in the school, like you get it in school or outside of school?
In school, you get free... when I was at school, you used to get free lessons with an instrument for a few years to see if you liked it. And my inkling would be to suggest that the answer to the problems lies in education and allowing young people the opportunity to try their hand at music and various other things. We ended up with this de-skilling of the music business because of the political inclinations to reduce funding for the arts. So, in the 90s and the noughties, everybody had to learn to code. Coding. You're only a worthy member of society if you know how to program computers. And if you're an artist, well, good luck to you,
Yeah.
And I feel that that's missing some of the point of the sort of humanist tradition and the Renaissance tradition and the Enlightenment, which is that if you were to give children, especially, one of my favorite bugbears is this thing with VR and AR. So if you add up the numbers between Google, Meta, Apple, Microsoft, they've blown like $140 billion allegedly on building these AR, VR headsets to no great degree of social impact. I look at that number and go, what difference would you have if that amount of money was spent on schooling children and giving them lessons on musical instruments and notation and music appreciation, and just gave people a rounded education so that they could decide, or we could discover whether they had a talent for making music. The joy of music is making it together. You can do it on your own. And you can do it with a screen in front of you with some clever AI doing question answer and playing along with your chords and suggesting rhythms and cascading arpeggios. You can do that. But that is not the same energy, the same spirit of the energy of sitting in a room with people making, even if it's basic beats and bashing things or, playing basic instruments. Nothing has replaced that in my mind. And I feel that without being a purist and too much of an idealist, I think the answer with the whole AI thing is that hopefully what we could do is become more human again and try and reestablish these kind of smaller gigs that aren't like massive stadiums, and try and go back to some of the grassroots of some of the smaller time venues locally. And I would, if I ran the world, I would definitely be in the business of trying to promote more local grassroots music making, give local venues a bit more time, money, and get more opportunities to get people in there and socializing. Now, the trouble is there seems to be a political sentiment in the modern era now that artists have to be you have to be suspicious of artists. Their artists are non-conformists. They're spreading interesting ideas that you might not want people to think about. I think it's very interesting in the current era, having listened to the protest music of the 60s, for instance, and Dylan and the Doors and Beatles, Hendrix. There's literally no one I can hear in the charts writing songs about what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in the climate, what's going on. There seems to be a lack of, and whether this is because the gatekeepers are very cautious, like, the Apple Music playlist people and the Spotify playlist people and the radio, there seems to be very little breakout of what I would argue is the old punky, hippie energy of criticizing the society you're in. And
although they do this, maybe they don't do this in songs, but they do this quite often in social media.
Yeah, they do.
I have to say, I see a lot of musicians who raise their hands in a lot of issues, and they do this on social media these days. That's what I have to say as a defense for those musicians. Although they're not these songs. And I one thing I want to just give you maybe one last more quote to think of, because you just said this. People like to do their music with each other in a room, and they make music with each other. And then there comes this quote. You heard this quote of Mikey Schulman from Suno. Did you hear about this? And he said it's not really enjoyable to make music now. I quoted it the last time here on the podcast. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice. You need to get really good at an instrument or really good at a piece of production software. I think the majority of people don't enjoy the majority of the time they spend making music. That's what he said.
Yeah. Well, I do remember that, hearing that quote.
And I think what I said about it was like, of course he has to say it. He wants to sell his product, and if he says it's so much fun to make music, he wouldn't sell his product. That's why he has to say it.
Yeah,
that was my explanation.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's it's interesting that if you look at the history of recorded music and you look at the Berliner disc, right, and you look at the original Edison wax cylinders, when the wax cylinder first came out, it was a dictation machine. It was it was designed only for recording voice. And then somebody came up with the amazing idea that it could be used for music. And the music publishing and recording industrial complex, if you like, that, I worked for EMI Records in the 90s, and that was the British version of that. It was 1897, and it was a company that did everything from make X-ray machines to printing presses for millions of records to having record companies, like Parlophone and the Beatles. Somebody came across the idea of creating music publishing to be able to sell more of these disc machines, right? So the music was an afterthought for the fact that you wanted to sell the hardware. And you could argue in some ways even Steve Jobs did that. He was obviously a fan of music, but he realized that music was going to sell more iPhones and more iPods than anything else, more than spreadsheets, more than web browsers, more than ringtones. It was the fact that these phones were going to be your Walkman. And so I think, getting back to the point of AI, I would argue that we are definitely in the world of computer-generated music, generative music. That is happening, and it's going to get better and better. And I think it's going to get harder and harder to distinguish between human performances and writing and machine performances and writing. I think that's a given. I think what the antidote for musicians is I think, like this idea of after the talkies in the 1920s in Jolson, people going into different fields, like going into studio orchestras, going into engineering and stuff around music. I have to tell you, I was not successful as a musician. When I was young, I wanted to be in a band, to be famous, and I wanted to go around the world and be in a rock band and be cool. I didn't manage that. But what I was good at was I was good in the studio, and I was good with computers and Cubase and tech, and I was good with synths and samplers. And I ended up moving sideways and working as a producer and working as an engineer. And then the internet turned up and I moved sideways again. And this time, what was interesting, I converged my interest in engineering with music, and I worked on the internet and the web. And what I would argue is that if you love music and you're passionate about it, you can lead a musical life. You don't have to just sit there and be the only thing you ever do in the morning is play the guitar, and you need to make a living from it, or you'll never do anything else. You can live a musical. Some of the best advice I was ever given was an old friend of mine called John Grant, and he was a drummer in a goth band in the 80s called Ghost Dance. And I remember being really frustrated when in my 20s I wasn't making any money, and I wasn't going to be famous, I wasn't going to sign. And he just looked at me and he said, "Andy, just lead a musical life." And I think that I know that's I don't want to sound glib, and if you're watching your revenue from the thing you did as a thing that you got paid for disappearing, well, I feel bad about that. But everybody has the ability to evolve, and music evolves. The way we make it, the way we listen to it evolves, and the art form itself evolves. And I feel like humans evolve. So I think to hold on to a vision of the past and a model of the past and go, oh my God, it can only be this, I don't think that gets us further along the line, So
I think this is the perfect ending. You just said the best phrase to encourage people in the end. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Dennis.
That was the new episode of the Illiac Suite. Thanks, Andrew Melchior, again for your time and amazing stories. It was a pleasure. If you have any questions, mail me at mail@theilliacsuite.com, mail@theilliacsuite.com. That is the address where you can reach me, and you can give me any feedback or also any suggestions who you would like to invite for one of the next episodes here in the Illiac Suite. Thanks for listening, humans. Take care and behave.